The night my son-in-law left my daughter to drown in 40-degree water, he was laughing. I heard it. That laugh. Low and easy, like a man who just told a good joke at the club. I still hear it sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. My daughter, 26 years old, 7 months along, carrying my first grandchild, had just gone over the railing of a 40-foot cabin cruiser somewhere off the coast of Maine. And the man she married was standing at the stern with a drink in his hand, watching the water close over her and laughing. I need to back up, because none of this will make sense unless you understand how I got there, how I ended up on that boat, in the dark, at 11:30 at night, watching my whole world come apart. Her name is Blythe. She's always been the steady one. Her mother and I used to joke that she came out of the womb with a planner and a backup plan. She's a kindergarten teacher. She bakes bread on Sundays. She calls me every Thursday without fail, has since she went off to college 12 years ago. Thursday at 7, you could set your watch to it. She met Prescott at a charity gala 2 years ago. He was 32, wore a suit that cost more than my first car, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never once being told no. His family owned half the commercial real estate in Portland. His father, a man named Aldous, which should have told me something, sat on 3 corporate boards and had his name on the side of a hospital wing. I'm a retired high school football coach. I live in a farmhouse outside of Harpswell. I drive a 12-year-old truck. I am not the kind of man who impresses people like the Wentworths, and I never pretended to be. But I watched how Prescott looked at my daughter, like she was something he'd acquired, not someone he loved, and I kept my mouth shut because she was happy, or she seemed happy. And what father wants to be the one who ruins that? They got engaged after 8 months, married 9 months after that. The wedding was at his family's estate. 200 guests, a string quartet, a photographer who charged more for one day than I made in my last year of teaching. I stood up there in a rented tux and gave her away and told myself I was being ridiculous, that he loved her, that she knew what she was doing. She called me on a Thursday in February to tell me she was pregnant. I cried. I'm not ashamed of it. I sat in my kitchen in the dark and cried like a child, because there is no feeling in the world like knowing you're going to be a grandfather. 3 weeks later, she called me again. Not on a Thursday, on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, and she was crying. She didn't tell me everything that day. She gave me pieces, that things were tense, that Prescott had said some things, that his father had made it clear the pregnancy was inconvenient timing. I asked her if she was safe. She said yes. I asked her if she wanted me to come. She said no, she was handling it. I should have gotten in the truck anyway. The weekend of the 4th of July, the Wentworths hosted what they called an annual family cruise. 30 miles up the coast and back, anchored for the night in a cove they'd been using for 40 years. Family tradition. Prescott invited us. Me, Blythe, a handful of his cousins and their spouses. I almost didn't go. Boats have never been my thing, and spending a night at anchor with Aldous Wentworth wasn't exactly my idea of a holiday. But Blythe asked me. She said she wanted me there. I know now that she was scared. I know now that she'd been scared for weeks, and that asking me on that boat was the closest she could come to asking for help without saying it out loud. We left the marina at 4 in the afternoon. It was a beautiful evening, I'll give it that. The coast of Maine in July, the water going silver and then gold as the sun dropped. Prescott played the host, drinks, music from a Bluetooth speaker, easy conversation about nothing. Aldous sat in the back with his oldest son, talking business in voices too low to hear. I stayed close to Blythe. She looked tired. 7 months pregnant, moving carefully, one hand always on her lower back. Around 9, most of the group had moved below deck. The night had cooled off, and the bugs were out. I stayed up top because I don't sleep well in confined spaces, and because something had been pulling at the back of my neck all evening, some animal instinct I'd been coaching myself to ignore. I heard them before I saw them. Prescott and his father, at the stern. Voices low but carrying across the water. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was sitting on the port side around the cabin, and the wind just brought it to me. She's not going to just agree, Prescott said. She will, Aldous said. Or she won't, and we'll handle it. The baby is a complication. We've discussed this. I stood up. I don't know exactly what I thought I was going to do. Walk over there, I guess. Ask them what they were talking about. Something. But before I took 3 steps, I heard Blythe's voice. She'd come up from below, And then I heard something I will never, as long as I live, be able to unhear: a splash. Not a big splash. That's what gets me. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a sound, like something going into the water. And then silence. I ran. She was in the water about 10 feet off the stern. I could see her, barely, the white of her shirt, her arms moving. She hadn't gone in feet first. She'd hit the water sideways and something, the hull, a cleat, I still don't know, had caught her shoulder on the way down. She was struggling. She was calling for me, not screaming, calling, like she was trying not to panic and losing. Prescott was standing at the railing with his drink. Aldous was beside him. Neither of them moved. I am 63 years old, and I haven't swum in open water in 20 years, and I cannot tell you what I did next as a decision, because it wasn't one. I just went over. I hit that water, and the cold of it was like a wall. It knocked the breath out of me. It grabbed me and tried to pull me down. But I could see her, white shirt in the black water, and I got to her. She grabbed onto me and I held her, and I kicked. That's all I did. I just kicked and kept her head up. I don't know how long we were in the water. Long enough that my legs went from burning to numb. Long enough that I stopped being able to feel my hands. The boat had moved. They'd moved the boat, and in the darkness I couldn't see the shore, couldn't see anything but water in every direction and the stars overhead. I talked to her the whole time. I don't remember what I said. I think I said her name over and over. I told her I had her. I told her to breathe. At some point she stopped responding and I shifted her onto her back and held her across my chest and just kept kicking. The Coast Guard found us 40 minutes later. Someone on shore had seen something from a dock. Still don't know who. Still haven't been able to thank them. And made a call. When they pulled us out of the water, my daughter was semi-conscious and hypothermic, and they were already calling ahead to the hospital. I didn't let go of her hand until they made me. She survived. I want to say that now, before I go any further, because I know how this sounds and I need you to know she is alive. The baby didn't make it. A boy. They told me later, after the surgery, after the hours in the waiting room where I sat alone in soaking clothes and stared at a wall. A boy. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, born too early and too cold and too still. They let me hold him before they took him. I don't have words for that. I don't think there are words. Prescott and Aldous told the Coast Guard it was an accident, that Blythe had been standing too close to the railing, that she'd lost her balance, that they'd tried to help but couldn't reach her in time. By the time I was coherent enough to say anything different, they had lawyers. Of course they had lawyers. People like the Wentworths always have lawyers. My daughter was in the hospital for 4 days. I slept in the chair beside her bed. On the second day, she told me what had happened, what had really happened, that Aldous had confronted her that evening about a post-nuptial agreement they wanted her to sign, that when she refused, things escalated, that Prescott had grabbed her by the arm near the railing and she'd pulled back, and then she stopped being able to say it. She just shook her head. She didn't have to say it. On the third day, I called my brother. Now, here is where I have to explain something about my family. My brother Carver and I were not close for most of our adult lives. 15 years we barely spoke. Old grudge, old wound, the kind of thing that starts small and then calcifies into something neither of you can quite remember how to move around. He lives in Boston. I live in Maine. We were, for all practical purposes, strangers. What I knew about his life was mostly secondhand from our sister, who kept both of us updated whether we wanted it or not. I knew he'd had a serious career in law. I knew he'd been appointed to something, some federal position, years back. I hadn't paid close attention. I hadn't, I'm ashamed to say, been interested. When I called him that morning, from a hospital waiting room, soaking wet clothes now replaced by a paper gown someone had given me, a cup of bad coffee going cold in my hand, I didn't even know if he'd answer. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. I didn't plan what to say. I just said it, all of it, in whatever order it came out. The boat, the water, the baby, the lawyers. When I stopped talking, there was silence on the line, and then he said very quietly, "I'm coming." He drove up that night. I met him in the hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning, and we stood there under the fluorescent lights, and he put his arms around me, and I fell apart in a way I hadn't let myself do since I pulled my daughter out of the water. We didn't talk about the 15 years. None of that mattered anymore. Some things burned through old wounds like they were never there. What I didn't know, what I had not fully understood about my brother's career, was the weight of what he'd spent those 15 years building. Carver had retired 2 years earlier as a federal judge. Before that, he'd spent a decade as a senior prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts, specifically handling financial crimes and corruption. He had, over the course of his career, put away 4 sitting politicians, 2 banking executives, and a state police captain who'd been running protection money for 30 years. He was not a man who was impressed by old family names or endowed hospital wings. He was, in fact, the specific kind of man that people like Aldous Wentworth had been quietly paying to avoid for decades. When Carver walked into my daughter's hospital room the next morning, he sat beside her bed and took her hand and he listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't ask leading questions. He just listened until she was done, and then he said, "You are not going to have to fight these people alone." What happened next took 3 months, and I won't pretend I understood all of it. I'm a football coach. Contract law and federal statutes are not my fluency, but I watched it unfold, piece by piece, and I can tell you what I saw. Carver connected my daughter with a victims' rights attorney in Portland, a woman named Eudora, who'd spent 20 years handling cases exactly like this, who walked into her first meeting with the Wentworth family's legal team and did not blink once. Through Eudora, my daughter filed a civil suit for assault, gross negligence, and wrongful death of the unborn child. 3 witnesses from the boat, 2 of them Prescott's own cousins, gave statements that contradicted the accident story. One of them had seen Prescott's hands on Blythe's arms. One of them had heard Aldous say deal with it 60 seconds before the splash. Carver, meanwhile, started making calls. Not public calls, private ones, to people he'd worked with for 30 years. It turned out the Wentworth family's commercial real estate empire had been under a low-level federal inquiry for 2 years. Nothing active, nothing moving, just a file sitting in a drawer somewhere waiting for someone to care about it. Carver found someone who cared. I also learned, during those 3 months, that Prescott had done this before. Not the same thing, not the boat, not the railing, but the pattern. A woman he'd dated before Blythe had filed a restraining order against him. His family had settled quietly for a number that kept it out of the news. There was a notation in a file somewhere, buried, the kind of thing you only find if you know where to look and have the credentials to access it. Carver found it. The civil settlement came first. I won't share the number because that's my daughter's business, and no one else's, but I will tell you, it was not a number that left the Wentworth family comfortable. Their lawyers fought hard and then stopped fighting. That is usually the shape of things when the other side realizes the fight cannot be won quietly anymore. Prescott was charged criminally in September. Reckless endangerment, assault. In Maine, the law on fetal homicide is specific about circumstances, and Eudora knew every word of it. The prosecution took on the wrongful death of the baby as an additional charge. When his lawyers saw the witness statements, the prior record, the federal inquiry running parallel, they came to the table with a plea. Prescott pled guilty to aggravated assault. He will not be on a boat, on a dock, or within 500 feet of my daughter for the rest of his supervised release. Aldous Wentworth resigned from 2 of his 3 board seats in October. By November, the federal inquiry had become something more formal. I don't know exactly where that stands now. Carver doesn't tell me everything, and I've learned not to ask. What I do know is this. My daughter is back in her classroom. She's teaching again, which she wasn't sure she'd be able to do, not so soon. She goes to a grief counselor on Wednesdays. She calls me every Thursday at 7, same as always. Sometimes we talk about the baby. Sometimes we don't. She got a dog in October. Big ridiculous golden retriever named something I can never remember how to spell and sends me pictures of it daily. She's going to be all right. She's not there yet, but she's going to get there. I know my daughter. Carver drove up to Harpswell 2 weeks ago. We sat on my porch and drank coffee and watched the water, which felt strange that first time, looking at the ocean, and we talked, really talked, about the 15 years, about what had started it and what had kept it going, and the particular stubbornness of men who would rather be right than be brothers. There were apologies on both sides. There was a lot left over that we'll probably still be working through when we're old men. But he's coming back for Thanksgiving. First time in 15 years. Some things you lose forever. I know that now in a way I didn't before. My grandson is buried in a cemetery in Harpswell, in a plot I bought the week after he was born and died. I go there on Sunday. I don't know exactly what I do there. I sit mostly. I talk a little. I am 63 years old and I spent most of my life coaching young men to be tougher than their circumstances, and I have never in my life felt as helpless as I did in that water in the dark. But here is what I also know. When I went over that railing, when I hit that water, and the cold tried to take me, I did not hesitate, not for a single second. And Prescott Wentworth and his father, standing there with their drinks, and their lawyers and their 40 years of never once facing a consequence, had looked at the two of us in the water, and assumed we were nothing. They didn't know about Carver. They didn't know about Eudora. They didn't know that sometimes the people you dismiss, the retired coaches and the estranged brothers and the daughters who just want to teach kindergarten and bake bread on Sundays, have more fight in them than you've ever had to develop, because nobody ever handed them anything. They mistook surviving for weakness. That was their last mistake. My daughter called last Thursday, 7 o'clock, same as always. She told me she'd started planting things in her garden. Late in the season, she knows, but she wanted something growing. I told her some things take longer to root. She laughed. It's been a while since I've heard her laugh like that, easy and real, like she used to. I told her I'd come down and help her with the garden this weekend. She said she'd make bread. I'll be there.